So to demonstrate overloading in static methods, I'm going to use the example they did in the lecture in the book for the account. So in the account class, they have instance data for account number, balance, and name. And they have a constructor that takes in those values and initializes the values. They have a method to deposit and to withdraw. And both of these methods return the balance. One will add to the balance and one will subtract from the balance. Then they have a method called add interest, which takes the balance, multiplies it to the interest rate, and adds that value back to itself. They have a method called get balance, which simply just returns the balance. And they overrode the toString method. So in the toString method, they're returning the account number, the customer name, and the balance of the account. And here's a driver class. They originally created 3 account objects, but I went ahead and removed them. So I'm only creating 1. I'm making a deposit, I'm adding interest, and then I'm printing out the value. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run, and here's the result. So the way an overload works, and I did talk about this already with constructors, is you're basically taking the same method or the same constructor, but you're changing the parameter list so that you have multiple options for the same method or constructor. So for instance, if I wanted to instantiate an object of the account class, but I only wanted to pass in customer name, then I need to overload my constructor to accept just a string for name. So in my account class, in addition to having an account object that accepts the customer name, the account number, and the balance, I want an additional constructor that's only going to accept the customer name. Here's a constructor I created. Now this is what we call overloading. So I actually created an additional constructor that only accepts one string parameter. So now when I go back to my driver class, I can instantiate an object using my new constructor. So on this line, I use my new constructor by only passing in the customer name, and then I output the results right here. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run this program. And here's my result. So now I want to overload my constructor one more time. This time I just want to pass in the account number. I don't want to have a customer name set, or I don't want to have a balance. So to do this, I need to go to my account class and create a new constructor that only accepts an account number. Here's the constructor I created. It's similar to what I did before. I'm accepting an account number. I'm going to set the account number, but I'm not going to set anything else. I went ahead and set name to just be a blank string, so there's not just null. And I set balance to 0. Now when I come back to transactions, I can create an account just by passing in an account number. So on this line, I instantiate an account object by simply just passing in an account number, no customer name or no initial balance. And then on this line is where I'm printing it out using the toString method. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and run. And here's my result. So this last line is where I printed out my account object, but I only had an account number, no customer name, and no initial balance. So this is an example of overloading a constructor. Now notice that all the parameter lists are different. So for my first constructor, I accept 3 parameters. My second constructor, I accept 1 parameter, but it's a string. My third constructor, I accept 1 parameter, but it's a long. If I were to make an additional constructor that accepts 1 string, Java will be upset with me. So I'm going to go ahead and try it. So here, I overloaded my constructor 1 additional time, but I'm using a string, and I'm also using a string up here. Java's going to get upset at me because it's going to see I have 2 constructors, and in both constructors, I have 1 string parameter. So when I attempt to compile, it's going to fail. And here's the error that I get when I try to compile. Java's telling me that a constructor that takes in 1 string has already been defined in the account class. So it's telling me that I can't create another constructor that accepts 1 string because I already have a constructor that only accepts 1 string. So I need to remove it. So we can overload constructors, but we can also overload methods, and it's going to follow the same pattern. So if I wanted to overload the method add interest, I can create a new method named add interest, but the parameter list has to be different. So this method takes in 0 parameters. So that means I cannot recreate the add interest method that takes 0 parameters. I need at least 1. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new method called add interest, which is going to be an overload of add interest, but it's going to accept a value in for the interest rate. So here's a method that I created to overload the add interest method. This method accepts a double. The double that gets passed in here is going to be used to calculate the new balance, where I'm going to multiply balance to this rate. The method that I had before is using the interest rate defined in this class. If you scroll up to the top, you'll see that constant for rate, which is 3.5. But in my overload method, I'm going to allow the interest rate to be passed in. So I'm going to take in whatever they pass in, and I'm going to multiply balance to that interest rate. So let's go ahead and test this. Okay, so in order to test the add interest methods, I need to call them twice. Once the original way and once the new way. So to verify this, I went ahead and deposited $100 into account 2 and $100 into account 3. Both of them have an initial balance of 0 because of the constructors that I used. I set them both to 0. Now when I compile and run, I should see that account 2 has $103 and account 3 has $108. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and run. And here's account 2, it has $103.50. And here's account 3, it has $108.50. So you can see that I was able to overload my add interest method. One takes in no parameters and one takes in a double. So what do you think would happen if I were to overload my add interest method, but this time I pass in a float instead of a double? Just like this. So both this add interest method and this add interest method are taken in one parameter. One takes in a double, one takes in a float. They're doing the exact same thing. But just so that's easier for me to determine which method is being called, in the method that takes in a float, whenever you invoke this method, I'm just going to set balance to be something outrageous. So now when you invoke the method add interest and you pass in a float, I'm going to just set the balance to $1 million. And I'm doing this just so I can determine which method gets called. So obviously if my balance makes sense after I call the add interest, then I know that this method was invoked. If it doesn't make sense, then I know that this method was invoked. So I'm going to hop back over to my driver class, and without changing anything, I'm going to compile and run. And you can see that my results are the same. So my add interest that takes in a float did not actually get called. But I'm going to go ahead and invoke add interest on account 1 and pass in a float. So here's me invoking add interest on account 1. I'm passing in 8.5% like I did on account 3, except I'm using a float literal. So now when I compile and run, let's see what happens. And here are my results. You can see that my add interest that accepts a float was invoked. So this is actually different than my add interest that accepts a double. Because when you go into my add interest that accepts a float, these were the statements that were called. When I go to my add interest that accepts a double, these are the statements that are called. So this is what we call overloading a method. As long as the parameter list is different, then Java's going to see these as different methods.